Good morning to everyone, to all of you. Welcome back to this program of La Ceiba Milenaria. Today we're going to address the relationship between science, the scientific method, and our way of understanding what we conceive as nature today. The American Dr. Carolyn Merchant, whom we've already cited before, developed an extraordinarily extensive, super beautiful, and super deep study to understand who the fathers or the influential individuals were who have been relevant in the process of building this entire comprehensive scientific framework that has been established as a supreme and unique way of understanding the earth, understanding the celestial stars above, and understanding the water, all this within the framework of the construction of modernity. So Dr. Carolyn Merchant has described several authors. Notable figures among them include Francis Bacon, William Harvey, René Descartes, and also the great Isaac Newton. So she carefully describes the historical context in which these fundamental parameters of science were first created and the profound implications they continue to hold for our relationship with nature. Now then, every one of these authors, these influential figures who were involved in different fields of knowledge, all had their theoretical and intellectual production centered around the year 1600 within the broader European context. Faced with this situation, we must ask ourselves then, what is the relationship between these men's profound ideas and what we experience today? What is the relevance of this reflection? And the relevance is clearly seen in the day-to-day of what we see in school, of what we learn in the daily life of educational institutions in general. To give you a specific example or tell you a personal story from my own biography, when my niece, who is currently 17 years old, was in school, she was about 6 years old at the time. She was taught to do a simple exercise in which she had to distinguish between living beings and inert beings. So she had a little table there, which I still remember quite well, in which she had to carefully classify a series of different items that they were putting here for her. So one of these items I clearly remember was the mountains. So she said to me, "Auntie, what do you think? Is the mountain a living being or is it an inert being?" I told her it's a living being. So I explained to her that within ancestral conceptions of existence, mountains are considered as beings with life. And that's how we consider them. That's also how I consider them. Furthermore, there are many sacred ritual expressions performed in these lands, like Ecuador, which I'm talking about, in which they start from this fundamental premise of mountains as living beings to be able to interact and relate within what a complex rituality means. But anyway, she just looked at me and said, "Auntie, well, I understand that." She said, "But so the teacher doesn't get angry? For now, let's put it in the inert section." And this situation, this event that happened more than 10 years ago, was repeated again now in my daughter's school experience. My daughter is currently 8 years old, and once again, something very similar happened. While in a conversation with a friend, she was explaining to her little friend that mountains are living beings, because we are also families of dancers of a ritual expression called Yumbada, which dates back more than 500 years. So within this dance, within this cultural construction that we have, well, mountains are essentially considered as living beings.
Oye, diciendo algo también tenemos que reír. Para eso, para sonreír, ¿no es cierto? Cógele de aquí, cógele de aquí.
So she was explaining to her little friend what the Yumbada is all about and everything else. And then a teacher appeared to explain to her that mountains are simply a bit of earth that has accumulated, and well, that there isn't much more beyond that. So this is the relevance of understanding what the origin is of the ideas that we are repeating and that we are constantly learning, because in one specific way or another significant manner, they are the very elements that enable us to possess a consciousness or a particular way of understanding the whole. It is important for us to remember that in the previous chapter, we carefully established the foundational concept of the whole to refer to those material components of nature, but also to those various immaterial components as well. That is to say, these two aspects are of paramount importance within ancient conceptions of existence, because they are precisely those elements that allow us to truly understand that life goes far beyond this simple set of experiences, physical factors with which we have a relationship. In other words, water can help us and does help us, in fact, to satisfy a basic need such as thirst, hydration, which is essential for our survival, but also the conception of water as a living being, with which we can relate in other dimensions and on other planes from ritual and sacredness, is also very important, as we will see throughout today's program. So, to truly understand this set of material and immaterial variables, we are going to delve into a detailed discussion regarding the entirety of the system. Here lies the intricate and complex relationship between these elements that came out of this set of ideas established more or less in this era of 1600 and that are consistently replicated and observed today. This, of course, did not occur through some simple mechanical process. It did not happen immediately, and it is certainly not accurate for us to simply claim that it's only thanks to the revolutionary work and intervention of a single person, thanks to the direct intervention of Bacon, Harvey, or any of these esteemed gentlemen who have been defined as the fathers of science, that we currently understand everything under this specific matrix, in which, as you can see, there is also a clear correlation where practically the material and the immaterial are classified between the living and the inert, or the living and the dead, thereby assigning each category its own specific level of relevance or value according to what we consider to be important. So it is an exercise of division and classification that also responds to these parameters. But while this process was neither mechanical nor automatic and certainly did not occur over the course of a single night, what we can see today is a lingering and visible remnant of this whole set of ideas that were extremely significant and highly relevant at that time. So, what can we truly understand from this perspective? That what happened here was a process of sedimentation, to call it in some way. The sedimentation effect, what is this? We have to think about the metaphor of the sea. In the vast sea, the water is constantly flowing. It's going from one side to the other. It goes through those natural cycles we know in which the water evaporates, then rises high into the sky, then falls back down in the form of rain. Well, anyway, it completes the entire water circulation cycle, which is something we see, I think, generally at 8 or 9 years old, precisely in childhood natural science classes. And then, in this water circulation process, a series of minerals are dragged along. So these minerals, over a long period of time, gradually settle and fall to form a layer of sediment at the base. This is the sedimentation effect that we are having here. That is to say, although this set of ideas is nourished, circulates, and flows like the seawater, at the very bottom, a kind of sediment remains. This is what we find today, and it is what allows us to understand these structures that manifest themselves 400 years later in our institutions. They are ideas, ways of understanding life, conceptions, whatever we call them. But the point is that they are more or less solidified in the institutions we know today and that have emerged within the framework of the coloniality of power, this power structure we already spoke to you about previously. So this is extremely important to understand, not as a mechanical relationship of direct cause and effect, or one where we have to identify certain people and say, well, today the destruction of nature is like this in such a way. No. Because it's also quite fascinating to understand that these authors, in one way or another, were all deeply preoccupied with the goal of better understanding the things and processes happening around what they conceived as the natural world. Whatever happened in their different contexts, whatever that generated, that's an entirely different matter altogether. But for now, it's important to understand this process. Now then, moving on to the significant effect of sedimentation, it is also quite important to emphasize that this process doesn't only happen here. It also occurs frequently, for example, in the specific case of the implantation of ideas on a spiritual level that have arisen here in Latin America without going too far. For example, when you go to the Santo Domingo Museum in the Santo Domingo Convent, here in the city of Quito, in the historic center, there you find the first texts or the first Bible that the Dominicans brought to evangelize the indigenous population that was here in Ecuador. This text, which is roughly this size, it's a large size, maybe about 50 by 25. It's written in 7 different ancient languages, which are surely no longer used by virtually any living person in Ecuador today. And they are accompanied by a library of almost 20,000 books that deal with a wide variety of diverse topics related to evangelization. Issues of philosophy, theology, sacredness, God, and various conceptions of divinity. In short, it is a set of books that what they did was effectively position or firmly establish the theme that of divinity within the frameworks of this Dominican institutionality in Ecuador. So what we are observing here once again is the effect of sedimentation, because it is highly probable that virtually no one has actually read those 20,000 books, but the existence of this entire bibliographic corpus and accompanying the Bible plus all the processes of punishment, the exercise of physical domination, and everything else there was to achieve the imposition of this faith generated an effect of sedimentation. An effect that is so great that to this day, for example, sometimes we post telling you about this case of the Yumbadas, comments on social media or videos about this, and there are people who call us pagans, worshippers of idolatry, things like that. So this has functioned quite effectively, and that's what continues to persist today. At this point in our long history, no one remembers the true origin of that Bible or that institution of the Dominicans, but we still have this profound and lasting effect of sedimentation. This is just as a parenthesis to explain to you in more detail that these types of processes actually exist in nature that allow us to see that there is a sediment. That is the material that remains settled at the base, which is exactly what we relate to and about which we must stop to reflect. Now then, it is also very important to keep in mind that in addition to this ongoing effect of sedimentation, what we find is a persistent power structure. This is exactly what has allowed these ideas, which were so distant in a place that was physically so far away at that time for those who lived here, to finally achieve being positioned in such a way that, until now, they constitute a kind of essential backbone of our institutional structures. These are the same forces that lead to these kinds of specific cases, like the ones I am telling you about regarding my girls, my niece and my daughter at school. So we also cannot lose sight of the fact that there is a significant power structure behind all of this. A power structure that is what Aníbal Quijano called the coloniality of power, a concept which we have already mentioned several times now. The coloniality of power, which is the underlying structure that has allowed all our modern institutions to be meticulously modeled based on what we admire, which has historically been the traditional European intellectual canon applied to various distinct fields, including the economic, the political, and the educational. But in addition to this pervasive power structure, what this clearly signifies and denotes is that there are specific mechanisms for the transmission of ideas. What exactly do we mean when we talk about these complex mechanisms for the transmission of ideas? Well, if on the one hand we have this diverse group of influential thinkers and individuals who were in France, in England, and in various distinct locations across Europe, in what is widely known today as Europe, well, there must be several ways for this set of ideas to eventually make their way to our own specific territory in a very concrete way. A territory that in the previous chapter we identified as being in a complex north to south geographical relationship. We are in the south. So these mechanisms of ideas and the transmission of these ideas are precisely what allow these specific concepts that we consider to be replicated and reinforced within this power structure that are relevant and that we are incorporating into our daily lives in different ways. I'm only going to mention that briefly for now because we're going to delve exclusively into the topic of power structures and the mechanisms of transmission of ideas in a north-south relationship in the coming chapters. For now, suffice it to say that there is a set of power mechanisms that are the ones that facilitate the transmission of ideas in this north-south relationship, and we will address that in the following chapters. Among the authors that Carolyn Merchant studies and whom she has identified as the fathers of science, we have Francis Bacon. When one carefully examines his influential book called Novum Organum, which was written in the year 1620, one finds a collection of specific philosophical ideas that are highly significant and directly relevant to what we are analyzing at this particular point. It is important to understand that we are going to deal with some of these authors, but from a perspective, let's say, of discourse analysis. To put it more clearly, we are not going to analyze or even begin to discuss whether what they said was true, specifically regarding the contents. What truly interests us at this moment is to understand how some principles or ideas that they had in relation to the natural world around them, they are relevant to this current moment in which we are living through a climate crisis of great relevance that forces us to think, no matter what, about the relationship we have with nature. So in this book from 1620, there are several elements that are very important. First and most importantly is the search for the truth. For Francis Bacon, the most essential purpose that lies behind an intellectual exercise or the use of reason is always found in the encounter with truth. It is precisely for that specific reason that he gradually develops a systematic and rigorous method to help what he calls intelligence to discern and identify the absolute truth. He says that we human beings think we are naturally attracted to observation and we are attracted to reflection. That is something deeply and inherently rooted within our very nature. But we have to help rationality and this intellectual exercise to have certain parameters to find the truth. So he says that the most important things are always the underlying principles, and not the forms. He consistently endeavors to delve deeply into the search for the most profound and fundamental issues, for the underlying structural principles of any object of knowledge that has been the primary focus of his intellectual concern. So that's why he works so much on the construction of a method that allows him to generate a certain type of reflection that leads him to this construction of truth. Because he also points out that intelligence is sometimes flawed or affected by a series of ghosts, as he identifies them, that undermine the possibility of reaching this truth. So he develops an entire detailed typology of what the ghosts are, like a kind of intellectual monsters that prevent the intellectual and real exercise, well, real for him, that ultimately lead toward the construction of this truth. And of these four authors, another who is exceptionally significant and relevant to the discussion we are having right now is René Descartes. René Descartes writes his Discourse on the Method in 1637. It is one of the most famous books he has. Like Bacon, he makes a great intellectual effort to propose a method for the construction of truth. Once again, the nature of truth is an object of concern, and once again, he carefully constructs a method. For him, truth is something that must be assumed only when there is sufficient evidence to be able to date its existence or to be able to corroborate that it is indeed so. And he also considers that there are certain flaws in our intellectual exercise that sometimes prevent us from reaching this truth. So that's why, like Bacon, he proposes a method. Both propose specific methods or mechanisms to arrive at a clear understanding of what they consider to be the truth. So within this method, what he proposes is that it's essential to divide whatever we're studying, our object of study, into the smallest possible parts, in order to have a better understanding of the whole of them. Furthermore, he considers that all these elements, all these parts must be enumerated. They must be quantified so that we can have the absolute certainty that indeed all the various components that are part of the objective or of that specific element that we are analyzing at the time are actually there. Because also these are systematic methods or ways of building knowledge that turn out to be applicable to any specific area or field of knowledge. Dr. Caroline Merchant, after she spent time carefully analyzing what was the discursive object, what the philosophical concepts of these authors were, she eventually came to the realization that what they were establishing was a way of understanding existence, a way of understanding the natural world and the entirety of the whole, which was fundamentally based on two principles: power and control. In other words, this comprehensive collection of philosophical ideas regarding how we should interact and engage with the earth, and how we should conceive all the natural elements and resources that surround us, were articulated to complex processes of power. In terms of that is the fundamental need to control all these elements and the mechanical form of control, but intrinsically linked to various economic issues and broader systemic processes. Already of their time, of their context, which what they did was to generate the already physical control of all the elements. Because also these mechanisms were the basis for the establishment of large-scale industrial processes, processes that affect us to this day, and that are precisely one of the major causes of the climate crisis we are experiencing. So the concepts of power and control over our environment first arose once we began to consider that all these complex elements or little parts of nature must be systematically broken down into much smaller parts in order to be fully understood and managed, allowing us to gain a deeper perspective on how the natural world functions as a whole. A series of mechanisms must be carried out or implemented to understand their functioning. Here, another mechanism or another way of understanding nature is established that is very important within Caroline Merchant's conception, which is the metaphor of the machine. The earth and all its parts begin to be seen as a complex machine composed of parts that function as a kind of gear, which must be taken out of their original context and isolated in order to understand how they work. And this is precisely what William Harvey, who is one of the great grandfathers of cardiology, he implemented these methods in his detailed studies on the heart. He eventually managed to understand how the heart works, including the circulatory system, the arteries, and the veins. So it was a truly remarkable and quite an interesting finding overall. We cannot dismiss, nor are we questioning these advances, because imagine everything that has been discovered and how much we have advanced as humanity as a result of these types of discoveries, right? But this has also brought certain consequences. We are going to analyze what the effects have been of the establishment of this single way of understanding nature and the whole. So, from this brief yet insightful discursive analysis we do of the ideas and of the fundamental principles that were behind the theoretical and scientific reflections of these distinguished gentlemen. So, there are several key elements that are noteworthy that we can summarize like this. First, the metaphor of the machine. Second, the search for truth. And in the third place, the objective and clearly visible. If we take a moment to analyze carefully what it truly means to understand that mountains, that plants, that any animal or any living being found on this earth should be conceived as a machine, then we are necessarily thinking of complex structures. Complex structures, intricate mechanisms, and various gears that function together as a coordinated set of parts that articulate with one another. That is to say, all the fundamental mechanical aspects. The great mechanics that Isaac Newton spoke of. And also, when we look at it from another perspective, there is the profound and complex question of truth. The diligent search for objective truth is closely related to these essential structures to the extent that they constitute the fundamental postulates or axioms of our understanding, that can be replicated by any single human being, completely independent of their context, their specific time, and their physical space. That is to say, they constitute structures in which the human being and their individual experience no longer hold any significant meaning. Where every individual experience is completely nullified. Here, for example, we can think of the case of great scientific findings in the history of humanity. Often things have been discovered, like the origin of vaccines, for example, and these are ideas that have been replicated by all of humanity and that to this day have saved us from death on many occasions, as happened with COVID until recently. Regardless of the stance we take or regardless of the consequences of the vaccine or not, we have to think of the mechanism or the vaccine as knowledge that was invented by some human being in history and that is later used and replicated, but whose origin is unknown. So here there is no longer a purely individual or isolated experience because knowledge becomes a foundational framework and structure that is used by various other human beings across society. And there is another aspect that is implicit in the principles of these authors that has to do with the purely objective and the clearly visible. In the analysis that Carolyn Merchant makes of the ideas of these fathers of science, she points out how this imposition or this establishment of the scientific method was generating the rupture of an organic vision of the earth or of nature, which was also championed mainly by women. So this discussion is necessarily situated in a gender issue. We are not necessarily talking about men versus women, but about the masculine in relation to the feminine. We will address that later as well, but for now it is enough to say that there is also a gender aspect that is important, because in this relationship or this organic conception that existed, well, there was a feminine type of knowledge that was undermined. In that place, the objective reality and the visible world were established as a primary field of intervention, creating a space for people to build these various structures. So this effectively reduces the concept of life to the purely material world. Why is the material so relevant in this specific context? The material is extremely important because it becomes a space in which one can intervene, in which we all can or they can reach agreements for the identification of these truths and for the establishment of these structures in which there does not have to be individual experience. And this is a logic that is replicated in many fields, not only in the scientific issue, taking the case of the vaccine that I mentioned to you. For example, it works the same way in the state. So what exactly does the state do? The state is an institution that has hijacked all the discourses related to politics, to what is important for life, to food, to health. In short, a countless number of things, but it works with this logic of structure and gears. And it attempts and strives to ensure that the unique and personal experience of every individual of so and such human being has no relevance, because there is a predefined structure that manages to articulate and that manages to generate ideas and principles and precepts for the functioning of this great machine that is the state. So this logic of the scientific method and of science goes much further than just the educational and academic fields, because what it has done is establish a way of understanding reality based on structures where human experience is being nullified. Furthermore, the physical material itself is the very place where all of these fundamental operating principles and complex mechanical issues are clearly evidenced and manifested. Consequently, it becomes an essential element of immense relevance upon which the focus of life must be centered. It is precisely for this reason that we must now return to the specific dual division that we have previously proposed for our consideration in La Ceiba Milenaria as a fundamental guiding principle for all our philosophical reflections. And it is the essential division of the whole into two distinct parts, the material and the immaterial. So, right here, we can truly begin to understand that this complex issue, these fundamental principles that we are currently understanding that derive directly from science and the rigorous scientific method, what they essentially do is reduce the richness of life to this purely material aspect, which we consider to be the origin of many problems today.